Good morning, everyone. Without further ado, I'll just pass you over to Yves Schemeil, and we'll continue off from our last session. There will be opportunity to ask questions and answers. To ask questions, please use the Q&A forum on the right-hand side. So without further ado, over to Mr. Schemeil.
Thank you, Michael. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. For those who need a sort of summary, or for those who had no opportunity yet to watch the recording of the first session, let's see what we have learned so far. First, there are crises. Of course, the crises are sources of contradictions. There is a good side and a bad side. They trigger behavior which are selfish, egoistic, and others which are more generous and altruistic. But this comes jointly. There are winners and losers of the globalization process, but the goals that they pursue are completely incompatible. So that means that we are facing global harms like a pandemic, and to adjust to this global harms, states must provision global public goods. Health is a global public good, for example, but also freedom to move is a public good. To provision such goods, which are very specific goods, not the goods that you find on the market, they must make norms, universal norms that will be respected, understood, and known everywhere in the world. To make norms and enforce rules unfolding from these norms, which are much more legal or formal, they must collaborate. There is no way out. Cooperation is easier within international organizations than on bilateral basis, because states are building up this international organization in order to cooperate. That's exactly the purpose. Within this multilateral framework, they can continue to grow. Economics will be growing, the economy will be growing, and to prevent the undesirable impacts of growth simultaneously. We know that growth comes with a number of undesirable effects. So the problem is that if we want to degrow, because that would be helpful to avoid any type of pollution, for example, well, that would also mean that a number of other problems will raise. Hence, states must forecast the future all the time. They have to find out ways to better estimate what will happen, like the most likely scenarios. And this is particularly needed in the hospitality business, because the attacks on this business are much more dramatic than probably in other sectors of the economic activity. And as this is a picture which shows obviously that there is a problem, we all know that, but I mean, there are planes which by now are flying that way. And so we can doubt, I mean, at the very beginning, we could doubt that it's possible to adjust to the crisis when you are at the head of an airline company, for example. Well, we should not panic. There always were sources of instability, and sometimes tragic instability. It's an old story. For example, there were terrorist attacks in a number of venues very recently, and in the past there were boycotts. Now we have this flight shaming issue. I'll come back to it in a minute. There were illiberal or neo-colonialist regimes which were fought by NGOs elsewhere, by people who were militating against for example, the apartheid in South Africa, and so they were pushing for a divestment. The fact that corporations and banks, financial institutions would withdraw their assets in these countries, in such countries. There are touristic hotspots that are becoming less eco-friendly than others, and for that reason, people don't want to go there, for example. There were also disasters, and the series, of course, are very impressive. Tsunamis, the Fukushima incident, etc. And an increasing pollution, which come from the sewage system, from toxic waters, like all that nuclear waste which is poured out in the Pacific Ocean after the Fukushima accident. So all this existed previously. Let's have a look at the boycott issue. Note that, for example, there are places in some countries in which tourists used to go. There are Airbnbs, there are probably some lodges, and sometimes you can also go and live with inhabitants and work with them, etc. But they are considered as illegal internationally in international law, and so this is the use of the TripAdvisor symbol to show that this is to be contested and that tourists should avoid going to such places. Flickskam in Swedish, a term which became popular because Greta Thunberg used it, and she said that she could just go without flying. She, as you know, reached New York from Europe on a boat, and that, of course, is sailing is always a possibility, but there are very few people who could sail, and it will take too long a time in order to deliver the type of goods and services that are expected elsewhere, and people cannot move that way massively. But it's very popular in Sweden and the Scandinavian countries by now. There are also, on the other hand, there is also this idea that there are some hotspots that are preferable to others because they are eco-friendly, because they have been certified by some sort of an NGO or an institute which is specialized in awarding this type of distinctions to places where it's good to go, good to live for a while, and nobody is exploited. This is all about fair trade and equitable activities, etc. So now we have a full range of ceremonies and opportunities where people celebrate, and this gives, of course, a lot of visibility to such hotspots, and some others are just the victims of naming and shaming because they are either ignored by the ranking system, not on the roster of destinations to go, or they are explicitly identified as places where you should not go. So the sources of instability are there. They were there. They are still there. They are recurrent. And the question is that we may have the impression that now instability is greater than in past decades, but it's a wrong assessment, because for young students it might not be obvious that aircraft were hijacked in the 70s by dozens, that people were killed. Previous epidemics have been numerous everywhere, but they were successfully fought, especially the cholera, Ebola, malaria. Well, I mean, I've been probably too optimistic in having it in the lists, because there are 400,000 people who die from malaria every year. But all sorts of influenzas, like the SARS-1, the MERS in Saudi Arabia, and so on and so forth. The major achievement probably has been the eradication of the tsetse fly from Eastern Africa by the joint action of the WHO and the International Agency for Atomic Energy, which is quite weird, but they use radioisotopes to sterilize the female tsetse fly, and it succeeded. And there was already war in Yemen and everywhere else in disputed places in the 60s and 70s, etc. So we have been used to see that there were very difficult times in a number of places in the world, and that would mean that it's going to happen and happen again, time and again. We are not going to get rid of all this completely, and certainly not in a short span of time. If you look at this picture, well, despite the fact that the furniture is, of course, dated and outdated, what you see here is quite similar to a number of pictures that we have seen on the consequences within hospitals of the COVID crisis. And the post on the right, of course, is less up to date than what we see on TV, but ads, public ads to behave in a very hygienic way right now are not very far from this 1918 or 20 posts in the US. So the problem is in the past, we adjusted to the crisis. Are we going to adjust to this crisis, and how? You know, the adaptation to changes of context should be effective, and probably more effective as time passes out. What is new, and that's good news, we have now early warning systems. States and international organizations put a lot of stress on establishing these early warning systems everywhere in the world about any type of risk or threat, like earthquakes, tsunamis, and nuclear incidents, etc. So we have quite a number of indicators in real time which show you how close we are to a dramatic incident. There are crash tests and drills and exercise, etc., and emergency protocols which have been settled not only by states but also by international organizations, as the WHO did, and we'll see some in this session. There is also overcapacity, which means that even the new public management considerations pushed a number of top managers in states, in firms, and in international organizations, even in NGOs, to try to avoid waste and delivering things online just in time, etc. Strategic stocks are still there, and of course the current crisis shows that they cannot be completely dismantled. We need to have the strategic stocks. India, for example, is a country in which this notion has been embodied by the top managers of the country a long time ago, and so they have, for example, strategic stocks of staples. They have strategic stocks of seed, strategic stocks of drugs and medicine, etc. And of course, they might be short of a number of masks and other protection, wear protections by now. But I mean, strategic stocks is a notion which is accepted in India better than in any other country in the world. And now there is something which is a novelty. Before making any decision, political rulers, call on experts appointed to advisory councils. And this is not only at state levels, it's also true, of course, at the level of the international organizations, because if you think at what the International Panel for Climate Change, IPCC, is, it's exactly this. It's an advisory council made of scientists who are recognized as being very competent on climate change issues. But do you have now advisory council, for example, for the how are we going to get out of the lockdown situation in which we are at the level of a municipality? There are quite a number of municipalities in France, for example, but elsewhere as well, who organize such consultation with experts. And that's quite new. Now, to adjust to the crisis, there are important questions as well. The idea is that we may not only react, but we may be proactive and possibly try to avoid the undesirable consequences of our behavior. So to mitigate the impact of world crisis, there are tools, technical tools, especially in the economy. economists can use what is called quantitative easing. So you drown the economies of the countries which are plagued by a pandemic with a lot of liquidities. States guarantee loans. There are rating corporations which give notes, marks, and select benchmarks to the national economies, the US economy actually in the current time, for example, hotels, restaurants, resorts, etc. The problem is that we are now in a position to understand that there are things which are no longer acceptable. And in such a plagued world by so many threats and risk, there are things which are no longer tolerable. It's no longer tolerable not to pay any attention to energy consumption home, for example. And you switch off the electricity and TV or whatever when you go out for a long period of time. There are things also which are not acceptable, like expanding the sanitary product in fields when it's not necessary or it's just out of proportion with the need, etc. But there are also norms. We already have seen that norms are an important issue if you want to understand what the world will be after 2020. It will be a world in which more norms and better norms will rule our behavior and our deeds. Norms say what mistakes to avoid. We know, for example, that there are things which cannot be considered as just things that we can neglect. And so from now on, quite a number of countries have prescription in order to sort out the waste that we have home and in fabrics. We know also norms that encourage some behavior but prohibit and ban other behavior. And also some policies are considered as being unavoidable. If you don't want to spend money on such a policy, then you will be constrained by your public opinion, by the world media, and by some observation from the outside. So you'll be named and shamed. And so eventually you will have to adopt new policy measures in some realms, like waste, like pollution, like climate change, and like hygiene and health. And there are goals which are now considered as preferable. I come back to this, but among these goals, there is this idea of equality. A better world is a world where people feel that they are more equal. But now, once this being said, how to get there is really a mess. And also, you never know exactly what equality means. Equality can mean equal opportunity. We will have the same possibility or probability to reach our end and to move to a new position, for example, or to migrate to a new country, etc. Or it can be a full equality. Nobody has nothing else and no more than any other person in the world. It could be also the outcome of an ideological policy driven by the idea that nobody should ever prevail in any field. So competent epidemiologists, for example, would be considered exactly equal to someone who is a non-qualified worker, and so on. So there are proofs or indications that this adjustment to the crisis already has started. For example, the WHO, because we are very frequently referring to the WHO during this current crisis, you can understand this. The WHO has opted very recently for a typology in which it would say what are the successive phases of a pandemic. That was made in 2009. That's an important date because it's 1 year after the economic crisis. It's 4 years after they opted for the universal regulation, sanitary regulation, which were more or less binding for states, whereas just before it was not. And so they are now, progressing, trying to improve their way to tackle this particular issue of pandemic with some sort of a protocol. This is a protocol with phase 1 to phase 8. It's a protocol. So we have now a protocol, and that's a tool of which we did not benefit in the past. Now, before we address the next issue, I would like to ask you, or Stuart, if Stuart is online, if there are questions to which I should answer by now, or if I should move on, or if I should make a break for 2 minutes just in order to breathe.
Hello, Yves.
Hello, Stuart.
Unfortunately, it's me again. Unfortunately, Stuart is not on the call. However, there are a few questions down the right-hand side which you may be able to see.
Okay.
One in particular, I can was perhaps interesting. They all are interesting, but one in particular I've called out. What are your views on the disruption of the supply chain due to this situation? How long do you think it will get back? Will it take it to get back into place?
That's a big issue. It's a very relevant question, but it's a big issue. Actually, it depends on the sector, and it depends probably on the technology. There are sectors in which you can easily phase in the new line of production out of the blue and from crash, even though for a decade or two you have abandoned this to the division of labor between the countries. And I'm sure that we'll come back to this after the crisis, whereas in the moment everyone thinks that we should have capacity to produce any type of product home. But there are also very high-tech products, very sophisticated products, and sometimes services, like software industry and whatsoever, in which I guess we will prefer to repatriate a number of activities which have been delocalized for decades. The Japanese already did this. They repatriated a number of high-tech companies from Southeast Asia and even China for a number of reasons. It would be too long to list all these motivations, but the fact is that the absolute division of labor based on economic indicators only doesn't work. So we have to select. I mean, the benefit of this crisis is that we're going to make difference between product sectors, level of technology, which is incorporated into a product or a service, etc. And so in the long run, there will be value chain, of course, but the value chain may be different from the value chain that we have now. And what will be stopped is probably the fact that we'll use brokers and automatic brokers like algorithm, which actually just make some assessments of where each component in the value chain of a final product is best produced at the best price, and then the whole procedure will follow, and you will never know in advance where you are going to buy your oil, where you are going to buy your wheat or your corn or your milk or whatsoever, and you'll never know what type of prepared meal, an exotic meal, Japanese sushi or Italian lasagna, how it will be cooked and will be processed and eventually wrapped up and delivered to you. This will depend on calculus made by the algorithm, which is in the software of a computer somewhere. So this type of thing is probably doomed to disappear, I guess, in the long run. That's part of the answer, but there are many other aspects which is probably too long. So is there anything else I can tackle by now?
Okay, that's great. At the moment, I think that's good. There are other sort of generic questions relating to real estate and sustainable projects, really asking for specifics about the industry. These are great subjects that are covered in other talks. Feel free to take these questions just now, or students, we can direct you towards the middle pages where there is other talks on real estate and sustainability. But they're just generic questions relating to latest sustainable projects and how real estate business, what they're doing in this, what could be their mode of survival.
Okay, let's come back to this question after I've addressed this issue of forecasting, etc., because this is part of the problem I'm going to address and probably more in depth in a minute. Okay, let's go back to the course. All right. Okay, that's my next point. Prospective and risk assessment are very important in any type of activity. They are more important nowadays than they were in the past because change, of course, is more dramatic and faster. And also, they are more important in the hospitality business. On this slide, you see the photograph of a genius, Isaac Asimov, who is an American and who wrote quite a number of sci-fi novels with a specificity at the time because he was the first one to focus on robots. That came from his background in, I guess, Eastern Europe. And as you know, robot, and I guess he is the one who coined the word robot, is a Russian name for worker. And so this idea that mechanical worker, automated workers could do the type of jobs that humans wouldn't like to do is an old idea, as you see. He was born in the 40s and the 50s, but he developed a whole theory about that. So there is quite a range of books about various points that he addresses through his imagination of situation, of course, which did not exist. And in The Naked Sun, this is the book to which I referred when I started this course, in The Naked Sun is dealing with Solaria, this planet on which there is 20,000 humans who never meet because their holograms only are invited to the dinner home, and they never meet because they are fearing of viruses and bacteria and anything. And the workers are those who are compelled to work outside and meet are robots. So in a way, he just figured out in the guise of a sci-fi novel what would be the outcome of the globalization process in the end. And this is why it is worth trying to better understand what prospective is about and how we could make sound estimates of what the future will be. The problem is that we've heard a number of words which are not exactly the same, and we have to understand the differences between these words because such notions are actually addressing different things. And you have an overview of all these possibilities here. There are some others, actually. As you see, you can understand that I prefer strategy at the bottom of the slide to prophecy at the top. And I'm going to just go into detail, not exactly in this order, but just wanted to show you that these forms of how to know what the future will be or could be differ a lot from depending on the angle that you adopt at the very beginning. Give me just a second, please. Okay, let's start with prediction. You know, prediction can be used as close to something that the Greek actually liked very much, the idea to go to an oracle, and the oracle would say what would come out in the future, sometimes with particular condition. I like very much this prediction, which is one Persian emperor who marched towards the Western Europe in Anatolia, what's it, Anatolia by now, Turkey, and they had to cross a river. So before crossing the river, he wanted an omen to tell him if this was a good idea. And the omen was, well, if you cross this river, an empire will fall. And so he thought that it was the Western Empire he wanted to conquer, but it was his own empire that he put into jeopardy by this too excessively ambitious move. So that's prophecy. Prophecy is something that can be absolute. You are going to lose this war. It can be conditional. If you do this and not that, then you can lose the war. But it's prophecy. Scientific extrapolation is different. There is no mysticism in scientific extrapolation. It's just that we know quite a number of things with some confidence, and the problem is that it's very likely that what we know conditions what will happen next. So prediction can be if, for example, there are quite a number of people who are jobless, and the rate of the jobs lost year after year, or even trimester after trimester, is tremendously increasing. And at the same time, there are quite a number of people which are very dissatisfied with the foreign policy of a government. Then it's very likely that in the next election, populist candidates will be favored over people who are more or less open-oriented and have a more cosmopolitic view, for example. So prophecy is a warning. I mean, I warn you, and if you don't do this or that, or if you do this or that, these things will happen. So I can guess what the future will be. For example, Cassandra in Troy, the legend of the war of Troy from Homer, she said something like, we are going to lose the war against the Greek, and it will be a catastrophe, we'll be dispersed, killed, and etc. So that's not only a guess future, but it's a curse. I mean, it's the prophecy is close to a curse. The future will be gloomy. There are a number of prophets by now who prophesize the fact that the future of the globe is gloomy and cannot be else. That's prophecy. While prophecy, in a way, is not satisfying, not very much satisfying. Extrapolation is something that we try to avoid when we are in a situation where things are close to a tragedy, but we also need to do something to use whatever we know by now and try to predict what will come next. So there are facts, and at some point the facts are missing. So, for example, we have recorded data on the population growth in a country, and our GDP per capita in the country, and at some point the statistics are missing. So when this happens, either we wait for the next phase where we get fresh statistics again, and in that time, and then in the meantime, of course, we have a dotted line, because this is a place where I'm not completely sure that the facts were as they should be if you have one point and the other point, and then you have a line between the two. So the data that we are providing are just likely, but are not factual. And so what we expect from that is that we can reach the next stage where, again, we come back to plain and continuous curves on which we have a lot of confidence. And this is extrapolating the present from the past, or extrapolating the future from the far future from the very near future, on which we lack data because we haven't not yet collected statistic enough yet. This is an example of extrapolation. You know, a number of people in the world started to speak about peak oil, meaning the point where the maximum oil would have been extracted, and then there would be a decline in the oil produced, in the oil reserves, etc. So there is some sort of a summit, and after this summit, the curve is going down anyway. I mean, the slope of the curve is the slope of the curve which turns down. So to calculate this peak oil point, you just have the cumulative production since oil was first discovered. Then you have the proven reserves, which are the reserves estimated actually according to quite a number of indicators. So you know in Saudi Arabia that they have produced such an amount of oil for a long period of time, since the 30s. And you know also that a number of reserves have been assessed to be there under the ground, and that they could be at any time extracted and exported. And then there are also future discoveries which can be expected and as are estimated according to what was the case in the past. So we know that there was some sort of a rate of discovery, and compared to the rate of consumption, then we might imagine that there will be this type of new reserve available, and then new export available for the oil-producing countries. As you see, this is also very logical, because we think that there is a curve and that this curve is going down at some point, and then we can reach for the top of the curve. If we identified it, then we are happy with this. So, and if you look at the graph, this peak is something like 2020, and we are in 2020. And nothing of the kind happened so far. So the peak oil, the point of the peak oil is moving ahead to the right on such graphs since the 60s and the 70s. I remember that very early in the 70s, when there was this first oil shock, people thought that the peak oil would be in something like 2000. Well, we are very much beyond 2000, and we are not yet at the point where oil is going to decline in our industrial activity and our energy mix. Not at all, but it might happen, but it's not yet the case. So you see, extrapolation is both logical and to some extent it is also troublesome and lacks some consistency and certitude, of course. To do prospective and try to avoid the caveats that you have in other type of predictions, you need a number of tools. For example, you need some surveillance. Surveillance means that you can get facts that are usually classified or not to be disseminated to a larger audience because they are sensible. And you have also the possibility to watch whatever people do, which means that for a number of philosophers who are interested in democracy by now, the idea that we are on the verge of being in a surveillance democracy instead of normal democracy is gaining momentum. It's getting more and more popular among them. So to do this, you need to gather data and process the data statistically and correctly. And such data are now gathered everywhere, from London to Beijing, etc. And there is some more consideration for the possibility to watch out more carefully and see what citizens do, and probably archive some of the data of what they do and what they think because of terrorism, because of pandemic, etc., even in the Western world. When you are doing this, what you are looking for in a very large number of facts which have been gathered automatically and that you cannot analyze, no human can analyze this massive data, big data. What you need to find out and to pick out is the emergence of something new, breaking points where things won't be exactly the same as they were in the past. So you need thresholds, or what in their jargon, the academics call tipping points, points where things are going to change. So there will be an after and a before. That's looking for what happened in the recent past. Now, you also can try to do some horizon scanning, meaning that you are looking for bifurcations in the near future, that we will be facing this the time where we have two options, for example, going right or going left, and then we have to opt for either one or the other, and we don't have much indication of where we go. There is no indication that if we want to go to Soho, we should go right, and if we want to go to Kensington, we should go left. That's something which actually we don't know. We are blind about the destination, but we know that at some point we have to make an option, whatever the what we don't know is beyond that bifurcation point. And we can do also impact analysis, meaning that if we know that the big attempts to our ordinary life are going to be faced, then what will come out next? And so we estimate a number of consequences of what's happening before our very eyes. For example, there are economic consequences of the COVID virus on civil aviation, which are conducive to such estimations. For example, the organization which is monitoring civil aviation worldwide has issued this document very recently, as you'd see, and I come back to it later, but that shows that estimates are a mean to go further and try to forecast the future. When you do estimate, you need to have correct figures. Well, that seems trivial and obvious, but that's not always the case. Look at this COVID crisis, for example. The death toll has been estimated quite differently in various countries, depending on how you would consider people dying home with a diagnosis which would be made by a local physician saying that it's very likely that it's the COVID which caused the death, or if you include those who only died in a hospital or in a retiring home, etc. So the figures can be difficult to assess as correct. And you also make logically consistent guesses, which means that fake news and imagination is prohibited. You should really stick to whatever consistent you have. Forecasts, therefore, very scientific, or they try to be scientific, and they try to resist tests which try to prove that they are either right or wrong, correct or wrong. If you drift away from this protocol, then you will reach a stage where it is no longer forecast, but it's fantasy or even fiction. And here we have an example of fiction. You all know Philip K. Dick, I guess, because of the movie Minority Report, which was very popular when it was out, and with Tom Cruise, etc. So forecasts, when it is scientific, is the inference of causality and the successive steps which will unfold from the fact that we have identified a relationship between a cause and an effect, and then another cause and another effect, and so on and so forth. And so we can have models, and we can modeling the data we have, And this is exactly what the IPCC experts do with climate change. They have mathematical models, and as you have heard very recently with this pandemic, there are quite a number of people who do the same with the propagation of the virus, the contagion effect, especially those who are working at the Imperial College in London with Ferguson. So this is forecast. So mathematicians are probably good experts in forecasting, provided they have the correct data. Now, when you don't, what you can do is just to extrapolate from whatever facts you have, something which could happen in the future. And in that case, you would be able to warn the governments, for example, that something very nasty will happen. It's not only likely to happen, but will happen if nothing is done to prevent it, or will happen anyhow, and then you have to prepare for it and be able to react positively to it when it occurs. So this is what the Minority Report novel says. It's that you can forecast crimes before they are committed, but you can also forecast hurricanes before they reach the coast. And that works quite well for hurricanes, but not for crimes. In the forecast, inference is in particular very important. So you have to figure out the future as an inevitable consequence of the present. That means inevitable. It means that there will be no option. So you have to eliminate all the options which are evitable, which could never happen, for example. So to take an example, but what example? If you consider the debate about growth and degrowth by now, due to the pandemic and this story of value chain and whatsoever, then what you can have in mind is that degrowth is an inevitable consequence, because we can do without, we can do elsewhere differently. And so it's the reasoning is the if then. So for example, when people start to fear contagion, then they start considering that it's not good to fly. So the assumption is that there is a fear of contagion, and this fear of contagion is becoming more prominent and more disseminated in the world, and so the number of flights will decline. So the if-then reasoning is very popular among scientists. Strategic analysis is much more popular among policy makers, but scientists also use it because it relies on hypotheses, hunches, options. So when you have a brainstorming about a crisis, and we had in a turbulent time, then people are starting to just try to express their views about all this, and so in the end, something hopefully may come out and solve the issue. And so it's when you look at this, it's a sequence of successive steps, and it's exactly as if you were playing chess. So you figure out that if you move such piece on the chess game, then chessboard, then in the end, a series of consequences can happen or not. And so you have various possibilities that you will compare to each other before playing. And the very good players are those who can have a good command of quite a number of such series of consequential moves on the chessboard. Let's just for a while try to better understand what a hypothesis is. It's not only because you are going to use it as a scientist, and that probably you will never become, but and you are not at all tempted to become a scientist, otherwise you would have followed probably another type of training. But it's important to understand what is a hypothesis, even in your future daily life, and you'll see why. It's a possible solution to a puzzling observation. So and so you are very much concerned about that. and you have a possible solution to this puzzle. You have an idea about what is the explanation, but you need to test this explanation because it's a provisional one. It's not the explanation that you're looking for, and which should be endorsed also by other people. So it's one step below a true confirmed thesis. Hypo means in Greek below. So it's below a thesis. A thesis is something that would be accepted by everyone. Like we have a thesis by now, which is that the bats are at the origin of viruses, of coronaviruses, through a vector, which can be another mammal, for example, before it reaches human beings. That's a thesis. Before it was a thesis, it was only an hypothesis, and the people had to observe bats to take samples of their spits or dejections, etc., and to observe also animals which would have been in contact with both bats and humans. And as said, very often said, it's more than a wild guess, but it is less than a well-established theory. So if you want to build a theory that will apply to any type of circumstances, which will be quite similar to the circumstances, the context in which you are by now, then you need hypotheses. I give you a scientific example. The COVID-19 death toll will be easing if people are locked down. So that means the cause of the easing of the death toll is to be locked down. So if you don't, the virus is going to be propagated even more than it is by now. The longer people are locked down, and the faster the death rate will decrease. So that's are things that you can test because you can measure. You can have measures, and these measures would either meet or not the expectations made during the hypothetical phase. I give you also a policy example, which would be closer to your interest in life, I guess. Here is the factual observation. The International Labour Organization has data, or the ILO data, on lost working hours because of the current crisis, shows the importance of acting fast. So that's something on which we can agree because it's just a fact. There are quite a number of working days lost, and people are more and more jobless, and the decrease rate of the economy is dramatic. So we can agree on this. Now, the hypothesis is the longer we delay giving tourism the financial and regulatory reform required, the more livelihoods will be at risk. That's a very recent statement, as you can see, of the Secretary General of the World Tourism Organization. The longer we delay giving tourism financial and regulatory reform required, the more livelihoods will be at risk. So this is a policy hunch because in a way, in the same sentence, you have the observation, which is factual, you have a prediction, which should be avoided, and you have a call for help from the authorities, which are able to come and rescue people in the touristic industry. Now, let's move to scenarios, which possibly are the most interesting components of this forecasting business. A scenario is based on the idea that there are alternative trends. So there is a scenario 1, scenario 2, etc. You can actually have quite a number of scenarios. Usually those who are making scenarios are happy when they reach the third or the fourth one. And then you compare this scenario and you try to assess which scenario is the most likely among others. Then that means that you should have, of course, criteria to say why you prefer this scenario to the others, or that you get new data in the meantime when you are trying to set up this type of scenarios. It takes a little time, then in the meantime things happen outside, and then you are going to have this input integrated into your reasoning. And to do this, you have tools. They are called scenarios tools. There are, of course, indicators for example, trend. The trend by now in fashion is the trend in fashion was previously, certainly before this crisis, to buy very cheap clothes which would be produced low cost somewhere, and then you throw them out because fashion changes, and you buy other things. There is a famous Spanish corporation which specialized in just doing this, and you all know it by name, but I mean, I'm going to skip the name. And the association of very attractive design, which is changing frequently with mass production at low cost, eventually is a trend. People are going to buy and throw out, and buy and throw out, etc. Now the next trend will probably be to look for durable wear, less determined by fashion, or the fashion will be to return to this type of robust sort of clothes, possibly. So there is also the idea of the mood. The mood is not only a word, it's not only something that we all know as being very trivial, are you in good mood or not, but it's also a scientific concept, because there are scholars who use it to test, for example, the popularity of a certain type of policy, the policy which encourages agriculture to use phytosanitary products, or the policy which, on the contrary, try to ban this type of products, can be evaluated according to the response in the population, and this will be called the mood, the global mood of the population. Will they be supportive of mass production at low costs, but with phytosanitary products, or will they move towards the more biological, organic type of products? This is something that you could measure. So you want to know which factor matter actually. This is a what-if technique, because you cannot use these indicators randomly. You have to have some sort of way to organize them. So the what-if technique is very helpful to organize data. What if SARS-2, for example, was fought as successfully as SARS-1 was? Because remember that we were not, at least in Europe and the Americas, we have not suffered from SARS-1. I mean, it was something which was much more restricted in terms of contaminated zone than SARS-2 is. So then we can have a number of consequences which unfold from this reasoning and see where we made mistakes in the past. We also have counterfactual narratives. That's a little complicated to explain, but factual narrative is just you tell exactly what happened according to witnesses in whom you can be confident, and so you just reconstitute the series of events which led to the current situation. That's not only a narrative in the sense that it's imaginative, but it's also just the aggregation of testimonies that you can collect. That's factual. Now, what would be counterfactual is to imagine that things could not have evolved in the same way. For example, if there is an accident or a car crash, you can imagine that if, for example, instead of looking for a CD to change music while driving, the driver could have watched the road carefully, and in that case, he would have avoided an aged people or a child crossing widely at an unexpected place the road on which he drives. So that's counterfactual. Now, if these things had been different, what would have been the following events? Then you can imagine it's like a chess game. A counterfactual narrative, we have an example. There is a series which is broadcast by now on several networks, which imagine a situation in which Roosevelt lost the 1940 election as president. And so, of course, you can imagine that if Lindbergh, who at the time was supportive of the Nazis and very empathic towards the Japanese, I mean, this situation would have been quite different. I mean, probably Pearl Harbor would not have happened. Probably the Americans wouldn't have invaded Europe in '44 and won the war, etc. So the interesting thing here is not the imaginative narrative that you can just coin out of the blue, because this, of course, never happened, and there was no probability that it could have happened. But the idea is that you can just conclude from the difference between what happened and what did not, some interesting lessons on which you can reflect. You also can ask a question like, what if Hillary Clinton had won in 2016? Well, I leave to you quite a number of solutions to this quiz, or to this question. Actually, I'm sure that you have a lot of answers. How useful can counterfactual narratives be? Well, the point is never make the same mistake again. So you have to identify where we were wrong. What was the mistake at the root of what eventually happened and that we didn't like at all? Next time, we should choose the right option, because we will have been enlightened by the fact that we know what the wrong option is. Now, look at the examples of scenarios. We come back to the Civil Aviation Organization. They have very recently asked for experts to write down scenarios about a number of countries in the world after the coronavirus crisis and the impact which this would have on flights. And the answer is, I don't know if I really want to show you this, don't misinterpret it. It's just a scenario. So for the time being, it's all things being equal, but things are not going to be equal because they are going to change, and people can make them change. So for the moment, it's just an estimate of what could unfold from the current crisis at the pace we already know, the pace which make aircraft stay on the tarmac instead of flying. And this is a slide I'm going to skip because you can come back to it whenever you want. It's not really encouraging, but as I told you, there are solutions to this in the long run. The problem is that we cannot predict, and this is what we have as a problem about predictions. We can predict that it's going to rain in Saudi Arabia at some point, but when? I mean, a prediction should say there will be rain on the 27th of June. That would be a prediction. Now, if you say it's going to rain at some point in Saudi Arabia, if it's 10 years from now, it's not a prediction. And here, of course, we know that there are a number of losses in the flight industry. And we know also that this industry is going to recover. When? It's not even possible to predict that particular tipping point, but we can look for it. So before we move to what we should do, now that we know how we could do, again, if there are questions.
Yes, down the right-hand side there, you'll see there's a question from Jonathan. It's related to the COVID-19. So due to COVID-19, there are now thousands of different standards for hygiene being created by hotels, tourism boards, countries, and associations. Wouldn't it be more beneficial if there was a global practical minimum standard created by the WHO and the WHO and the WTO, which could be adopted and then implemented? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, you see, first, this idea of minimum standard, it already exists. And the fact is that there are agents who go beyond the minimum, which has been set by, for example, the WHO or other organizations. So you always have the possibility to display more goodwill than is expected from you according to the agreement that you signed, to the norms to which you agreed once discussing and concluding a discussion or a negotiation within such an organization. So that's one thing. It already exists. And if you want to see how important for us these standards are, you go to the International Standard Organization. And we're surprised that the ISO norm that you all know with a number X or Y, this ISO norm is also a norm which actually rules the world in a number of aspects. So there are things that, and I'll come back to it, for example, with food and meals and restaurants, I mean, in the next session. So that's one thing. So, the other thing is that if you add up some new standards to the existing ones, you may also have this variety. People may opt for standards which are in a way diverging from the principles on which the minimum standards have been imagined. Of course, this is a problem, but again, it's not easy to keep on doing this for a long period of time. During this crisis, for example, we have a number of agents who say, all right, masks are recommended by, wearing mask is recommended by the WTO, by the WHO, but it is not said that it is compelling. So we in the municipality of whatever, Stuttgart or elsewhere, we decide that it is. So everyone should wear a mask, and if they don't, they will be punished. There will be a sanction. Well, if it is done in Stuttgart, but it's not done in Berlin, there is a problem, of course. And it's even worse if it's done in Germany, but it's not done in Ethiopia, and it's not done in Singapore, and Singapore has another standard, etc. So in the long run, if people do this in various cities and various countries, they will have to adjust because there will be protests, because there will be people who will use benchmarks saying, well, you know, it's better in Singapore than it is now here. So we have to adjust and adopt the Singapore norm. So in the end, one norm is going to triumph. It will be based on the bottom of the pyramid, which is internationally designed within an international organization. And on top, you have some very smart addition on which a number of people rally after a while. That's what a benchmark is. So guidelines, etc. So this will win in the long run.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Well, the misspelling is really telling and interesting because it was written Vovid, and so you have now correction saying it's COVID, but Vovid, if it could be Vovid, we will love, in French, vivre. It will be better. Thank you for that. Okay, I'll come back to the course. But again, you can, Mike, if you think that there is something worth of stopping the presentation, I do it immediately.
Sure, thank you.
So if we try to imagine the future, we know that there are now various ways to imagine the future and that they differ on a number of aspects. The question that we should ask are as follows. Is an increasing influence of international organizations likely? Now, if I stop at that point, there are quite a number of scholars, including some of my colleagues and some of my friends among these colleagues, who would say, no, you know, of course, because the states are those which create international organization, provided that these IOs are just complying to their standards and they're just following their goals and they don't do anything else. So they are ancillary. They are there to help, not as autonomous decision-making centers. And if they do, it's because states have an interest in this. They can give them some room for maneuver in certain sectors, but certainly not, for example, in security, where armaments, weapons, soldiers, garrisons, bases, etc., remain within the basket of the national states. All this is true, but that doesn't mean that influence will not grow, because power is one thing. I mean, the International Red Cross has no power to constrain a state to allow its representatives somewhere to visit people in a prison in case of a civil war, for example. Think of Syria. But if the Syrian government doesn't accept the ICRC representative in the Middle East to organize this type of visit, this means that it has something to hide, and something bad, of course, something which is not acceptable. So that means that the ICRC has no power to compel the Syrian government to accept visits to the people who are jailed in Syria, but it has enough influence to put some pressure on the Syrian government to accept this eventually. So this influence is growing, and there are people who abandon the idea of talking about power, because power is a misleading notion, and they prefer to say control. Are you in control of something? Well, of course, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, is in control of a certain number of misbehavior, lack of consistency of with the commitment made at the level of the organization in Geneva by some countries at some moments, and they have retaliation means. So, you know, that's some sort of control. So if you substitute control to power, quite a number of objections to this, the answer yes to this first question are just outdated. Which IOs in particular, that's something to figure out, because we don't really know, but I'm going to address this issue carefully, in particular in the sector which is of some concern for you, hospitality, etc. The IOs which are becoming more influent are in those which directly address health and mobility issues, because, as I said, health is a primary global public good, and all the others are unfolding from that. So the World Health Organization and the Organisation de l'Aviation Civile Internationale, because it's in Montreal, so it's in French, and so the ICAO is never used by anyone, for civil aviation. There are also those which are indirectly involved in regulating the two sectors, which has an impact on hospitality business. So the International Labour Organization, for example, because it sets quite a number of rules about the number of hours you can work a week, at what age you cannot work, until what age you cannot work for money, or you can work at all as a child, and what type of benefits, social benefits you are entitled to get, etc. And there is also the ISO, International Standard Organization, because this organization says, for example, that you cannot have a 3-star hotel if there are no there are a number of assets are missing in the mix of offer you can give to the tourists who are going to stay at your hotel. And same with the plugs, and same with any other things, and also with the type of aircraft on which you board, and so on and so forth. There is one of my colleagues who tried out some sort of an anticipation about are we prepared to change or not, and that's an interesting case in this type of exercise when we come out from this crisis. So I give it to you as an example. and it's a quotation in the next three slides, a quotation of the main article in which this was extracted, from which it was extracted. So COVID-19, if only the crisis was truly synonymous of change, so that's what we expect. We expect that we are going to change. Many thinkers are writing at an almost every speech on how we might improve the world after the pandemic. So improvement is possible, and imagination is in control. But it's not going to happen, or not everything is going to happen, because the range of ideas is tremendously large. People offer solution, or so-called solution, alleged solution. You can go vegetarian or vegan. You can think that the environment should be your main concern. You can also look for a system, health system, which would be properly funded, of high quality, and duly supplied with medicines, with protection wear and whatever, and beds, of course, and should be available to all, not only for those who have the means to spend on a better health system. There is also the idea that capitalism may be more caring for vulnerable people, for those who suffer, for those who are ill, etc. And this look idealistic, because there are too many options. These options are contradicting each other, and most of them are utopian. So what is more likely, unfortunately, is a return to the normality that existed before the crisis. And we know that in the past, this is exactly what happened. I mean, remember that between the two world wars, for example, people returned to the biases and the type of misbehavior that they had before the World War I, which led eventually to World War II. And there was also a situation in which transformation were needed and were even imagined and then debated publicly, but they never happened. So are we going to be, are we going to change? Are we going to remain and return to the good golden days, even if there was also golden? Let's be realistic, says my colleague. Radical changes are needed. However, once the idea that we are living in a very special context where the lockdown make us stay home and avoid contact is behind us, then if there is no political resolve and commitment, or individual resolve and political commitment, then nothing will need to change. And what we understand from this quotation is that the author, who is a professor of political economy and business ethics, is not absolutely convinced that we are going to adapt to this crisis to avoid a new one of the same sort. And the WHO itself, when you look at its website, tries to avoid this trap or get out of this trap. So they have very recently elaborated what they call a recovery roadmap. So there is a road towards recovery, and if we recover, then there are things which will be as they were before the crisis, and others which had to be invented. So let's see exactly what the very recent statement, I guess it's 1st of May, 6th May, yeah, 6th May, so very recent, yesterday. Crisis can exacerbate existing inequalities. So the problem is focused not only on the health condition of the people, it's focused on the idea that people are unequal in health, which is demonstrated in higher rates of hospitalization and death among certain populations in many countries. So, of course, poor people, people who cannot be confined because of the type of habitat in which they live, etc., people who have to work, otherwise they just die, etc., are even, of course, in a less enviable conditions when in time of confinement. We must address this now, I mean not tomorrow. but we also must be persistent and not abandon this issue once it is behind us. We should prioritize diagnosis and care for those who are most at risk. So now it's not always about diagnosing the type of illness. When anyone comes and consult a physician, and those who have the means. For example, if you're in Lebanon, each time you just pass the threshold of a medical cabinet, you have to pay $100 before you move ahead. If you just step back, you still have to pay the $100. So there are a number of people who, when each time they have something like a problem, they go and pay the 100, 200, or 300, depending on the number of analyses they have to make before the diagnosis is made, and then they have the treatment, etc. And those who cannot afford this. Of course, solidarity exists, and family can try to share the cost of the diagnosis and the treatment afterwards, but that's not the issue. So I go on. This is not only the right thing to do; it's a smart thing to do. So that means, you feel better if you do this than if you just go back to the good old times and you forget about anything you have learned during the crisis. So addressing inequality is the smart thing to do. We cannot end the pandemic until we address the inequalities occurring. That's an inference. That's the to make some inference from the situation in which we are. If we say that it's because of the inequalities between countries, between people within countries, and then if we cannot solve the issue of too much inequality, then we will have other pandemic in the future, and we will be in the same situation to not being able, actually, whatever we try to do, to make everyone able to either avoid to be infected or will be cared according to the best standards of the health science at the time. So the WHO goes on, or the Secretary General of the WHO, whom you all know by now, Tedros, Dr. Tedros, as I say, as we work on responding to this pandemic, we must also work harder to prepare for the next one. So we know that there will be a new wave of this virus, of another one. It will be an opportunity to lay the foundations for resilient health systems. So our health systems are resilient in normal times. But if there is such a massive attack on them, as we have been the witness in recent weeks, then it won't work at all. If we learn, and it has been ignored for too long, so science, knowledge are very important to solve these issues. If we learn anything from this crisis, it must be that investing in health now will save lives later. So spend money now, although it's not absolutely necessary now, but then you will be very happy in the future because it will spare you a number of casualties. History will judge all of us, not only on whether we got through this pandemic, but also on the lessons we learned. Now, the problem is that, can we learn lessons from the past? Can we learn lessons from anything? And this is a problem I'm going to address very soon. Because once a crisis is over, people tend to return to the pre-crisis situation without changing anything to their behavior and to their cognitive maps. Now, if we take another organization which is directly involved in the hospitality business, the World Tourism Organization, which is an agency, the UN agency, I will present it in detail in the next session. But for now, let's just focus on how do they react to this crisis. Well, they have strategic plans, like a number of organizations. And a strategic plan means that, whereas you are not yet in a situation where you should change a number of things, you can imagine that there will be challenges in the future and that you will have to adjust to these challenges. And so you make an exercise in forecasting this type of challenges and solutions. And so you can opt for a 5 years plan or a 10 years plan and this will be revised year after year according to new facts and new data. So how will we get to 2025 or 2030? Well, they have, for example, a roadmap to get to a stage where a high ambition scenario is elaborated. That was very recent. But this high ambition scenario, despite the fact that it was thought out in March, is not about the COVID crisis. Not at all. It's about climate change. So you see, the conclusion is that they have a scenario for mitigating climate change, embracing a low carbon pathway with awareness and optimization. So what they have as a roadmap with a high ambition scenario is not at all pertaining to the current COVID crisis. It's addressing the long-term issue of climate change. So we still have to wait for them to elaborate a scenario about this precise issue. Let's now see what awareness and optimization mean. Awareness means that we need evidence-based targets. We need evidence. We need data. We need measurements. So that means that anyone should share the kind of data that are collected in any place in the world, and this will be free and this will be universal. There is one example of such an exchange, which is the World Meteorological Organization, WMO, whose headquarters are in Geneva. The WMO is a very interesting case because it was created on a basic idea. You first have to collect indications about the weather within the same tools, in the same conditions, wherever in the world. And then the second principle is that you should share this freely, whatever the context. That means that in time of war, for example, the belligerents exchange informations about the weather in the country which is bombed, which are received by the country which is going to bomb the former. So this happened in Serbia, for example, in the 90s. It's happened in Iraq in 2003 and so on. So the meteorological offices there continued to share the information collected about the weather, which helped a lot. I mean, the enemies to organize their military operations. As for optimization, it means that we have instruments and strategies to scale up mitigation and adaptation in the tourism sector with all stakeholders. That means that everyone which has a stake in this sector should be heard, should have an opportunity to make his or her voice plain by any vector and channel. This is now this particular precision about the difference between mitigation and adaptation. When you mitigate, you prevent. So you are trying to treat the causes of climate change. So, for example, you stop burning fossil sources of energy, hydrocarbons, etc. Adaptation means that, well, it happens because you cannot do much about it. There is an increase in the ocean, the level of the ocean increases, for example, and you cannot do much about it, but you can organize the reaction and find solutions to that. For example, you can have higher protections against the waves. You can also build on a different type of foundation. You can imagine that if there is some sort of a tsunami that cannot be expected, or you have a gigantic kind, so you will evacuate according to a protocol which is rehearsed from time to time, etc. And so this is why the World Tourism Organization says that we live in one planet, on one planet, and so we should travel with care. And of course, if I had to stop at that point, I would say the best thing I can wish you is to travel with care wherever you are and wherever you go, or will go when the confinement will occur. Okay, I'll take some more questions also at that point.
Okay, there's a question here about your thoughts on the vaccine trials. What are your thoughts on the vaccine trials that are about to begin soon in Italy? Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, not at all. You see, the problem with vaccines is that you never know how long you are protected. First, you never know if the genotype of the virus is so similar to the previous one that you are still protected against the new one after having been vaccinated for the previous one, which is no longer contagious. So if the idea is that once people are vaccinated, they can travel, they can go to resorts and have fun and go to restaurants and enjoy meals, etc., behind the question, I'm not sure that reaching a stage where a vaccine exists will be the solution to the crisis. I guess you know what was called as herd immunity is probably a better solution than the vaccination for everyone. Besides, there are diseases against which we have no vaccine, and for example, malaria, AIDS. I mean, you know, there are drugs, of course, and that the new. Actually, can be optimistic because once you are actually infected by the virus, this one or the next one, then the experience that has been reached during this particular crisis, which was very acute, which plagued the health system and the hospitals everywhere, and is still going to do this in countries in which the impact has not yet been as high as in Spain, Italy, or France, for example. But the therapies which have been experienced in the emergency, apparently they work. So the last informations I got from physicians and people who do research about this virus. Yesterday, for example, I had a discussion with a physician who knows a lot about that. And he told me that the only thing which really works is a combination of drugs which have an impact. And we also know that, you know, the type of protocols that was adopted for people once they were in intensive care and they need respirators, etc. Now, I mean, they use a very different technique. It's lighter. They don't use artificial coma, for example, anymore. So they made a lot of progress. So vaccination, well, we can get a vaccine, probably not before months or years. Will it be enough to make people able to feel comfortable once they board a plane which is full of passengers, for example? That's the test. Will we go to an airport full of passengers? Will we board a plane, 380 planes with 700 people on board? I mean, I'm not sure about that as far as I am concerned. So that's a problem that we probably solve in the future, but vaccination might not be the way out. The way out will be that we will be sure that the cure will not be as tough as it had been so far, and the prognosis will not be as unacceptable as they were in the past, because at some point we said that probably 40 to 50% of people who went to intensive care would die, which by now is lowered to something like 10 to 30%, and will decrease again because of the therapy that are experimented by now. So that's to give you some comfort.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. I think we're certainly over time at the moment, so maybe there's just maybe one final question here, because you were talking about recovery. Do you think recovery will be different in different continents? Is that something that's possible? How are different continents or different countries within these continents have different systems that are better prepared?
Okay. The lesson I myself draw from this crisis is that there are we lack explanation to understand what Norway and Portugal within Western Europe, continental Europe, are so far spared by the virus. We lack explanation. We lack explanation for the difference between the death toll in Germany and in France. Although, unfortunately, the spread is going to diminish between the two countries. But we certainly understand that if you look at the curves, that once the country is plagued by the virus, then the evolution is always the same. Whatever the political system is, whatever the hospitals are, there is no big difference. I mean, they are affected or impacted in the same way. Now, of course, the degrees may matter, because if it's a matter of 1,000 deaths avoided or 10,000 deaths avoided, it matters a lot. But you see that the curves are so similar that it doesn't. I mean, the cause cannot be found in the differences in political systems. If there is a difference, a political difference is in the way governments reacted to the WHO recommendations, and did they behave according to the WHO regulations? Yes, if we look at this, we'll see differences possibly. But there are also countries in which we don't have statistics. There are countries which have not yet been under the invasion of this virus and might escape because of the weather, because of the season or whatever. But I'm sure that the problem will remain the same for everyone. So the solution is research, of course. This is what is done by now, and so medicine may be very helpful, but hygiene and the way people behave towards each other might change. In France, we kiss each other each time we meet. In England, you shake hands with someone the first time you meet, and then you don't need to do this 5 times a day. Well, in France, if you just refuse to shake hands with someone, you may be considered as a terrorist or as someone who is asocial. These things are going to change, obviously. Social distance is going to remain, I guess, in a way or another, and that would help a lot for people to travel, for example, to have good time in nice resorts, resort areas, and so on. So, but political systems, no, it's not. What the only thing to end up with this, the only thing which seems to work, is the tracking. It's a tracking process, because if you look at Taiwan and South Korea and even Japan, these are the countries where tracking was used very early in the development of the pandemic. So the outcome for this big, dense country, which is not the case of Norway or even Portugal. Here we have dozens of millions of people living together and being in contact every time. And, well, they are very few people who have deceased from the virus. This is because of tracking. Now, a lot of people don't want tracking to be implemented for moral, ethical reasons, legal reasons, or whatsoever. So that's a problem. The only solution is if we could track all those who have been in contact with other people who have been sick and people who have reached a stage of immunity, etc., etc. But of course, if you look at the whole mankind, we won't reach that stage. Never. Okay. Thank you, everyone.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank
you, and thank you very much. And then again, we'll see you all next week, next Monday, in the same place,
Great.
Different time. But we'll send out the link.
Great. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.